Should the supreme leader in Iran be worried right now?
I would say he should be very worried, yeah, he should be. As you know, they're negotiating with us. They were thinking about starting a new site in a different part of the country. We found out about it. I said, you do that, we're going to do very bad things to you.
It's a deal that would be acceptable, but the one thing, and right up front, no nuclear weapons. If we could have made that deal 2 years ago, we would have made that deal, but they weren't willing to do that. Now they are willing to do it. If they would have offered this deal originally when we first started, it would have been accepted immediately. We'll see what happens.
Should leaders in Tehran be worried right now? That depends on how you define pressure, because what's unfolding across the Arabian Sea is not just another round of naval exercises. It is a layered chessboard of deterrence, signaling, and strategic positioning. And every move is being watched, measured, and interpreted by capitals thousands of miles away. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth. Roughly 20% of globally traded oil passes through a narrow corridor only about 21 miles wide at its tightest navigable stretch. On either side sit Iran and Oman. Every tanker that enters that channel represents not just energy, but leverage. Energy markets track it by the hour. Insurance firms price risk against it daily. Military planners build contingency scenarios around it constantly. When warships begin clustering near that corridor, the world pays attention. The United States has surged naval presence into the region many times before. Carrier strike groups routinely transit from the Pacific through the Indian Ocean into the Middle East. But each deployment carries layered messaging, readiness, reassurance to regional partners, deterrence to adversaries, and flexibility for policymakers in Washington. The arrival of a U.S. carrier strike group in the Arabian Sea signals that Washington wants options. Air power at sea provides reach. Intelligence gathering, electronic surveillance, maritime patrol, strike capability, and visible presence without permanently basing forces on foreign soil. A carrier is not just a ship. It is sovereign territory that moves. But the story does not end with the United States. China's naval footprint has expanded dramatically over the past decade. What was once a largely coastal defense force has evolved into a blue water navy capable of sustained operations far from home. Long-range deployments, anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden, port visits across Africa and the Middle East, and multinational exercises are now regular features of Beijing's maritime strategy. When Chinese surface combatants deploy westward into the Indian Ocean or toward the Gulf of Oman, it reflects more than symbolic presence. It reflects an emerging doctrine: protect sea lines of communication, safeguard energy imports, and demonstrate that China's interests are global, not regional. Over 40% of China's crude oil imports transit through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a marginal statistic. It is a structural dependency. Energy security underpins economic stability. Economic stability underpins political continuity. Beijing's strategic planners view maritime choke points not just as shipping lanes, but as pressure points. So when tensions rise near the Gulf, Chinese risk assessments extend beyond military calculus. They consider supply chains, domestic markets, industrial demand, and geopolitical influence. Now layer in Iran. Tehran sits along the northern edge of Hormuz. Geography gives it influence that far exceeds the size of its conventional navy. Coastal missile batteries, naval patrol craft, submarines, fast attack boats, drones, and sea mines provide asymmetric leverage in confined waters. Iran's doctrine has long emphasized denial over dominance. It does not aim to outmatch larger navies ship for ship. Instead, it aims to raise the cost of intervention. Fast attack craft swarms, mobile anti-ship missile systems, naval mines seated in narrow channels, shore-based radar and surveillance. Layered, distributed defense. The presence of outside powers complicates this equation. When U.S. forces operate near Iranian shores, it is interpreted in Tehran as coercive signaling. When Chinese or Russian vessels operate nearby, it can be interpreted as diplomatic balance, or at minimum, a hedge against isolation. But balance does not equal alliance. Despite years of joint exercises between China, Russia, and Iran, there is no formal mutual defense treaty binding them into automatic military response. Their cooperation reflects overlapping interests, not unified command. These drills emphasize interoperability, communications practice, maritime security narratives, and symbolic partnership. They are not collective security guarantees. That distinction matters. Naval exercises in the northern Indian Ocean have occurred periodically since 2019. They typically include anti-piracy drills, communications coordination, search and rescue operations, and occasionally limited live fire components. Live fire exercises are not inherently escalatory. Major navies conduct them routinely as part of readiness cycles. The difference lies in proximity and timing. If multiple naval forces operate in overlapping areas during heightened diplomatic tension, the risk shifts from deliberate confrontation to accidental escalation. History reminds us that accidents, not strategic design, often trigger crises. In 1988, U.S. and Soviet vessels physically collided in the Black Sea during a freedom of navigation operation. That incident did not spiral into broader conflict. Why? Because communication channels existed, because deconfliction protocols were in place, because commanders understood escalation risks, because political leadership on both sides chose restraint. Today, similar mechanisms exist between major powers. Naval officers use bridge-to-bridge radio communication, internationally recognized signaling procedures, and incident-at-sea agreements intended to prevent misinterpretation. Professional militaries train specifically to avoid unintended escalation. Radar contacts are verified, maneuvers are calculated, weapons remain under strict rules of engagement, but presence still sends messages. A carrier strike group represents layered defense and layered offense. Air defense systems, electronic warfare aircraft, submarines operating unseen, missile-armed destroyers, and carrier-based fighters combine into a mobile combat ecosystem. Chinese destroyers, particularly their newest large-surface combatants, reflect Beijing's determination to field modern, capable platforms with long-range sensors and vertical launch missile systems. Their deployment far from home waters signals operational maturity and strategic ambition. Yet numbers on paper rarely determine outcomes. Missile inventories matter, reload capacity matters, sensor integration matters, satellite support matters, air cover matters, submarine positioning matters, cyber capabilities matter, electronic warfare resilience matters, training and doctrine matter, and perhaps most importantly, political will matters. No nuclear-armed state casually initiates direct naval combat with another nuclear-armed state. The economic consequences alone would be staggering. Closing the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, would spike oil prices almost immediately. Energy markets would surge. Shipping insurance rates would skyrocket. Global supply chains, already fragile in many sectors, would strain under uncertainty. Energy importers across Europe and Asia would feel immediate shock. Emerging markets dependent on stable oil flows would face inflationary pressure. Financial markets would respond within hours. That shared vulnerability creates restraint, which brings us back to the central question. Should leadership in Tehran feel pressure? Yes, but pressure is not synonymous with imminent war. The United States deploys naval forces to signal deterrence and maintain alliance credibility. China deploys naval forces to signal reach, energy security commitment, and global status. Russia deploys forces to reinforce relevance and project influence. Each actor pursues its own objectives. Tehran's calculations revolve around regime security, deterrence credibility, domestic legitimacy, and regional leverage. Washington's revolve around non-proliferation, alliance assurance, freedom of navigation, and strategic signaling. Beijing's revolve around energy protection, global presence, and multipolar positioning. These objectives intersect geographically. They do not fully align strategically. When analysts describe collision courses, they often mean overlapping interests in confined space, not inevitable kinetic conflict. Physical collision is the least likely outcome. Naval officers are acutely aware of escalation ladders. They understand that miscalculation, not malice, is often the greatest danger. Intelligence transparency also plays a stabilizing role. Satellite tracking, commercial vessel monitoring systems, and open-source maritime analysis make surprise deployments difficult to conceal. Fleet movements are often tracked publicly days or weeks in advance. Visibility reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers panic. Lower panic lowers the chance of rash action. So what is unfolding? A phase of intensified signaling. Exercises planned months earlier are interpreted through the lens of current tensions. Routine carrier rotations are viewed as escalation. Long-range destroyer deployments are framed as confrontation. Perception magnifies risk. But perception does not guarantee outcome. The Indo-Pacific remains the central arena of long-term U.S.-China competition. The Middle East, while strategically important, is not Beijing's primary military focus. China's logistics base in Djibouti enables sustained operations in the Western Indian Ocean, but it does not equate to regional dominance. Likewise, U.S. carrier rotations reflect global commitments. The U.S. Navy operates multiple carrier strike groups worldwide, alongside allied naval forces and submarines that rarely appear in headlines. Strategic depth exists on all sides. So why does this moment feel especially tense? Because global power competition is intensifying, because regional crises are interconnected, because digital media amplifies worst-case scenarios instantly, because rhetoric sometimes outpaces restraint, because nuclear deterrence makes even minor incidents feel existential. But deterrence often resembles brinkmanship from afar. Warships maneuver close to signal capability. Exercises rehearse coordination to demonstrate readiness. Missile systems deter by existing, not by launching. Heavy presence can, paradoxically, reinforce caution. When forces are visible, lines are clearer. When lines are clearer, miscalculation becomes less attractive. The greatest danger is not deliberate aggression, it is misinterpretation, a radar lock misread as targeting, a drone flight misjudged as hostile, a live fire drill misperceived as attack rehearsal, a communication failure at sea. That is why communication channels matter. That is why rules of engagement matter. That is why professionalism matters. The Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz will continue to see multinational naval traffic. Exercises will occur, statements will be issued, markets will react, commentators will speculate. But history shows that even during intense rivalry, great powers have avoided direct naval warfare against one another. The Cold War saw close calls. It saw brinkmanship. It saw tense standoffs at sea. It did not see open naval war between superpowers. Today's environment is competitive, tense, and strategically layered. It is not automatically apocalyptic. So should Iran's leadership be concerned? They should be attentive. They should be analytical. They should calculate carefully. They should recognize that every action is observed globally. But the same applies to Washington and to Beijing and to Moscow, because in confined waters carrying 1/5 of the world's oil supply, escalation benefits no one. The real contest is not about who fires first. It is about who signals most effectively without triggering unintended escalation. Power projection, energy security, alliance reassurance, strategic messaging, economic stability, domestic politics, international credibility. These are the drivers shaping decisions. As long as communication channels remain active, naval professionalism remains intact, and economic interdependence remains strong, controlled competition remains more probable than uncontrolled conflict. The Arabian Sea is not automatically the prelude to a world war. It is a reminder that in a multipolar era, presence equals influence, and influence must be managed carefully. The coming days will test signaling discipline. They will test deconfliction mechanisms. They will test political rhetoric against military restraint. They will test whether strategic patience outweighs emotional reaction. History suggests that when nuclear-armed states operate in proximity, caution ultimately prevails. Watch the deployments, watch the exercises, watch the diplomatic messaging, watch the market reactions, but understand the deeper layer. Naval presence is often about preventing war, not initiating it. In the Strait of Hormuz, prevention matters more than provocation. What happens next will likely be measured, deliberate, and closely monitored by every capital involved. Because in waters this narrow, in a world this interconnected, and under the shadow of nuclear deterrence, no one can afford a mistake.